me by Berdella. Don't stick that hand. They call me by Berdella.
The Wikipedia article, it's not very detailed in terms of what he did. There is one, I mean, for people who are really into this sort of thing, which I'm not actually, there is one true crime book that has been written by him called Buried Rights. It's Rites. And I will say it's poorly written. It was written in the middle 90s. It evinces, I mean, if you read it now, it evinces I don't even know if it's still in print actually, but it evinces a really kind of unfortunate, bizarre paranoia about gay people generally, which is kind of unfortunate to read now, when you're reading it.
Sure.
And also the author.
As if and somehow like all gay people are serial murderers or something.
Yeah, or something. I mean, there's just even without that, I mean, there's some gross stereotypes about the gay community generally. And also gross stereotypes about occultism and about witchcraft and things like this. The thing to remember about when Bob Berdella was caught, or when he, which was 1988 or 1989, it was right at the beginning of what would become the witch craze thing, and it actually peaked in the early 90s, but
Satanic Panic.
The Satanic Panic was just beginning in the late 80s, and Bob had amassed one of the largest collections. I think it was at one time appraised at like the 5th largest collection of antiquities in the country, in North America at the time. And so his house was just stuffed with all of this weird crap, like from Tibet and from India and from, much of it stolen, indigenous stuff that had been stolen. But because of all the weird crap that he had in his house, the police at the time just made the assumption that he was into satanic stuff, or just like he liked weird stuff, but he in my experience of him, he was not into anything. In fact, I asked him once, what sign were you born under? What astrological sign? He goes, oh, I was born under the money sign. That's what he said. So, he was not like into spiritual stuff at all.
Yeah, he wasn't into like New Age. He had
right. And to be clear, he was not a cannibal. I mean, he wasn't like Dahmer. He was not like Dahmer in that way. He did not, I mean, what I was able to determine later on, and this was later on, obviously, after reading this book and just, thinking about it and, even talking to him a couple times while he was in prison and, stuff like that, what I was able to figure out was that the killing part was not something that he was that into. It was the torturing part at the beginning.
Yeah.
And then, sometimes, in a sense, and this sounds so awful, but sometimes, people died as a result of that, and sometimes they had to be killed, as a result of that. But then the other part of it, although this was the more strenuous part of it, the other part of it was disposing of the bodies and kind of pulling it over on the police, because he hated the police. He hated the police. And there were some actual good reasons for his dislike of the police in Kansas City at the time. But he, as a gay man, and also just, the other thing that people have to remember is at the time when he committed these crimes, when they initially arrested him, they held him for sodomy because they had to prove everything else. And at the time in Missouri, they didn't always obviously, enforce this law, but simple sodomy, which was gay sex essentially, simple sodomy could get you 15 years in the state penitentiary. So that's kind of the nature of sort of the politics, the sexual politics, that existed with the police at the time. And he had been a minor, earlier in his life when he had first come to Kansas City. He had sort of dabbled in a minor way with certain types of drug trafficking. So, he was known to the police for that, and because he had connections to the police department. He was also aware of their corruptions. And at the time, I don't know how the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department is now, but at the time, it was a fairly corrupt institution. There was no independent oversight of them at all. They sort of operated as an independent government agency, and they were known for the brutality, and they were known for the racism, and for their homophobia, and for their participation in drug and human trafficking from time to time. Certain members, not obviously not the whole force, but so there was corruption within the police department, and so he detested them. He considered them all to be hypocrites. And so if he could like commit this crime and then dispose of the bodies in the way he did, which was to cut them up and put them in garbage bags, so that the bodies would never be found, except for those parts that he kept in the house and buried in his backyard. But his ability to pull that over the eyes of the police, that was the other way in which he kind of got a thrill, I think. Berdella was more of an opportunist. He didn't go out actually looking for victims. Victims would sort of come to him, and they would, and in fact, the book talks about this, and he talked about this in some of his interviews, that people would come to his house, and then it would just occur to him, oh, this is somebody I could do this with, or whatever. Mm-hmm. And not everybody that he dated or that he saw or brought home did he do this with. But the day before he was arrested, I was working at this place where I had a part-time job. I had started back to school to eventually get my graduate degrees. And I was working at this part-time place in Kansas City, Missouri. And I worked as kind of like the office manager. And his boss, my boss, there at the job where I was working, had his power of attorney and was also a business partner of his on certain things, management consultant and things. So Bob would come by, like maybe twice a month, and they would talk about legal stuff and business plans, and Harold always did his taxes and stuff like that. Well, anyway, the day before he was arrested, he came in, and I was there at the front desk, and he had an appointment with my boss, but he had to wait a little bit because my boss was always talking to somebody. I remember he was talking on the phone, and so there was always like 10 minutes or so that you had to wait. And so anyway, I was talking to Bob, and Bob started telling me he started saying, yeah, I'd heard that you had gotten a cold, and I was really concerned about you, and he had brought me some over-the-counter like medication, which I didn't take because I actually didn't need it because I had my own, but he'd like brought me some medicine, and he said, and I just really, at one point he said, I just always have really wanted to tell you that I've always considered you to be one of my best friends, which was weird because it was like, I didn't know Bob had friends, in my mind, I thought, really? And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He says, I've always sort of been able to talk to you about, things that mattered to me, like, my beads and my relationships. And I guess we had, when I worked for him, I guess we had sort of, talked about that stuff. But for me, we had talked about it on a very surface level, so, but apparently for him, those were important conversations. So, so it was just really weird because he said that which was on a Friday, the next day, which is a Saturday, which is when I usually worked for him when I did, I decided that I would go in and see him because I hadn't been to the store for a while. And so I went in, and I went in about 11:30. And he was renting space to a young jeweler, another artist at the time that was sort of in the same shop area, but he was like renting a part of the shop area for himself. Now he's an established jeweler somewhere, but and I walked in. His name was Russ, and I walked in, and Russ said, is it possible that you could like man the front for a little bit because Bob left for lunch and he's never come back? Okay. And I was like, okay. And so I did for about an hour, but then I had to go because I had planned to work, right? so I said, Russ, I really got to go. So Russ was like, okay, fine. I'll try to figure out how to do this myself. And so I left, and 15 minutes later, the place was raided by the police. They were shutting his store down, and everybody that was there, Russ and all the customers, they rounded them all up and took them to the police station. And so I missed that by like 15 minutes. Well, what had happened was his last victim had gotten loose and gotten out of the house. He was suspected in the disappearance of a couple people.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean. It's like, it's we don't really know. I mean, part of the conversation that I had with the police later on, because I mentioned to you earlier that I was never actually interrogated by the police as such about it, but because there were a couple of other people who knew me and who were business partners of him, who had known him, who intervened on my behalf. I don't know why, but they just did. But the police obviously wanted to talk to me too, because I had known him for almost a decade in various places, around town. And I'd worked for him and I'd been in his house once. And, so I knew him. And yeah. And so obviously they wanted to talk to me. So after he had confessed and everything, and I think he was in prison actually by that time, because it didn't take them too long to do all of that.
Right.
Because he confessed. But a policeman came over to my apartment and sat and talked to me for about an hour and a half. And it was just a weird interview. I mean, it was not about the crimes that Bob had committed. First of all, he brought Bob also took photos of all of his victims, of them being dead and stuff. And there were several photos in the pile of photos that they found that were obviously taken by third parties, that Bob was in the photo, but the way in which the photo was done, there had to have been other people present. Okay. So this policeman brought some of these photos, which you're not actually supposed to, those were like evidence photos. So he brought some of this stuff to my house, which I really didn't appreciate looking at. And he was asking me questions that at the time didn't make any sense, but now, later on, I figured out were clearly about, he was trying to establish whether or not whether I knew whether or not Bob was part of a larger ring of people, like a sadomasochistic ring of people that may have been involved in murder, And at this time, by the way, this was right during the same time periods, like the spring of 1988 or something like that. It's right during the time period when the trials for the Franklin scandal, which either they were just kind of peaking then, and so there was this, and that was in Omaha. Those people who know about the drug hubs in the Midwest, they know that there is a direct pipeline between Omaha and Kansas City, and then further places up north. So Omaha is like a distribution point from Kansas City, even more than St. Louis, from Kansas City to up through the northern plains, that goes up into the northern plains from Omaha. So Omaha is at least at the time, was like a central drug hub. And so I think he was trying to determine whether Bob was connected of the Franklin scandal or not. He had to have known about it. I was aware of, in my small capacity, early in the 1980s, when I lived on the street for a while before I got my life together. I was aware of human and drug trafficking activity that was happening in the part of Kansas City that I was living in, because I was specifically warned by people on the street that I knew, and also by people that were coming out of this one mental health institution, which, by the way, was shut down. It was a county-state institution, but there were people in that institution who, when they came out, and I knew of them from, I had some drug and alcohol problems of my own at the time, but they were very specific about warning me away from certain places, because this type of trafficking was known to occur there. And I mean, some of those places don't exist anymore. One of them was right off the plaza. The building that this happened, that was pointed out to me, no longer exists. They've torn it down. But So when I found this out about Bob, and that connection, or that possible connection, I was like, the police knew about all this stuff, because even in the early 80s the police knew about it, and they didn't do anything about it. In fact, some of them participated in it. They didn't do anything about it.
Berdella. They call me Berdella. They call me Berdella. Don't stick that hand. They call me Berdella.